The sow was nursing her piglets, and when the mother returned, a miracle happened. Can maternal instinct deceive nature itself? Can it make a predator see a friend in its prey and a victim defend someone else's offspring? This story did not begin with a question. It began with a sound. A dry, sharp crack of gunfire shattered the morning silence of the forest, startling the birds and freezing old Antip Zakharovich on the farmstead with an axe in his hand. He knew that sound all too well. The sound of quick, merciless death. At that very moment, in his warm barn, smelling of rotten hay, there was a different kind of silence. A dead silence. His pride and joy, his 4-year-old sow, Marfa, lay motionless, turned away toward the wall. Just yesterday, a dozen strong piglets had been wriggling around her. During the night, a disease had come, swift and vicious. By morning, none remained. Antip, whose face resembled cracked bark, stared at the huge, mourning body of the animal, and his own heart ached with a dull, familiar pain. He had lost his wife many years ago, and since then his family had consisted of this farm, the forest, and its silent inhabitants. Martha was not just livestock. She was part of this passing world. The old man sighed heavily and went out into the yard. The forest was silent, as if keeping the secret of the morning shot. He did not yet know that these two tragedies, one loud in the forest and one quiet in his barn, had already become intertwined in a tight knot. Before we continue, let us know which city you are from. We are interested in knowing where our videos are being watched. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your rating. It motivates us to make new and interesting videos. Well, let's get started. The next day, while walking around his property, Antip heard something he shouldn't have heard. A thin, plaintive squeak came from under the upturned roots of an old spruce tree, where the ground was torn up and smelled of alarm. The former gamekeeper moved silently. His heart sank when he looked into the hollow. There, huddled together, trembling, were two tiny, still blind balls of brown fur. Bear cubs. Newborns. He looked around. No sign of their mother. Only dried drops of blood on the ferns a few meters away. The picture formed instantly. A shot, a wounded bear, a panicked escape. She was either dead or too far away to return. Antip knew the law. Don't touch. Don't interfere. Nature would take care of it. But he also saw two tiny creatures doomed to a slow, cold death. He stood there for a minute, then another, listening to their desperate squeaks, which sounded like cries. Then, cursing himself, the poachers, and the whole unjust world under his breath, he carefully picked them up. They were almost weightless. He hid them in the bosom of his old coat and hurried home, feeling their weak bodies tremble against his chest. He was committing a crime. But at that moment, he didn't care. At home, a struggle began. Antip mixed some warm goat's milk in a bottle and attached an old teat. But the cubs would not take it. They poked at it with their blind snouts and squeaked, but their instincts did not kick in. Hunger and cold were already sapping their last strength. Antip sat on the floor of the barn in a separate corner, feeling completely helpless. He, who knew the forest like the back of his hand, could not save two tiny lives. And then, from behind the wooden partition, a quiet, long sigh came. It was Martha. She heard the squeaking. The pig, which had not touched food since yesterday, stirred. A crazy, desperate thought popped into the head of the stubborn old Antip. A thought that went against all his experience, all the laws of nature. What if? The risk was huge. A stressed pig could easily kill someone else's babies. But there was no other way out. Holding his breath, He picked up one of the cubs and entered Marfa's pen. The sow slowly turned her huge head. Her small, intelligent eyes stared at the squeaking bundle in her master's hands. Antip lowered the cub onto the straw a few steps away from her. He froze, ready to snatch it back at any moment. Marfa struggled to her feet. She moved toward the cub. Her shadow covered it. The old man clenched his fists. The sow bowed her head and gently nudged the brown fur with her snout. She took a long, noisy breath. Feeling the warmth, the cub squealed louder. And then something happened that Antip would not have believed if he had not seen it with his own eyes. Marfa made a quiet, guttural grunting sound. It was the same sound she used to call her piglets. She lay down carefully on her side, exposing her swollen teats. Then she gently but insistently pushed the bear cub with her paw toward her belly. The hungry baby, guided by pure instinct, found a nipple and greedily latched on. A moment later, Antip brought the second one. Marfa accepted him too. She lay there, breathing heavily, watching the two orphans of her sworn enemy drink her milk. Antip silently left the pen, closed the door, and leaned against the wall. He, a reclusive old man, had just witnessed a small miracle. And he had become the keeper of a very big and dangerous secret. A secret that was already beginning to attract attention. 100 kilometers from the farm, in the district center, a young and ambitious game warden named Yuri Volkov was studying a map. He had heard rumors of shots fired in the Tikolesiye Reserve. It was his job to investigate such reports. Yuri was a man of the new generation. He believed in GPS trackers, camera traps, and strict adherence to instructions. Old gamekeepers like Antip seemed to him relics of the past. On the third day after the shots, Volkov's official UAZ Patriot was already dusting the forest road. He found the place. There was trampled grass, a rifle cartridge case, and tracks. Tracks of a large female bear and drops of blood. A lot of blood. The animal was seriously wounded. But the tracks ended at a rocky outcrop. The bear seemed to have vanished into thin air. Yuri combed the area for hours, but to no avail. However, he was sure that the wounded and possibly aggressive beast was somewhere nearby. And he began his planned search of all the nearby winter camps and farmsteads. Just for the record, Number 3 on his list was farmstead of A.I. Zakharovich, a recluse, a former gamekeeper, a man with a reputation for being a sullen and taciturn old man, the perfect candidate for hiding something. Meanwhile, a secret life was going on at Antipa's farm. The bear cubs, fed on rich and nutritious pig's milk, were growing by leaps and bounds. They had already opened their eyes, 2 shiny beads curiously exploring their new world, the wooden walls, the mountain of straw, and the huge warm body of their foster mother. Marfa turned out to be the perfect mother. She licked them, played with them, pushing them with her snout, and grunted menacingly if they tried to crawl too far away. Her own longing receded. She had a family again. Antip watched them for hours, bringing Marfa the best pieces of boiled potatoes and pumpkin. He knew that this idyll could not last forever. The cubs were growing, and with them, the danger. What would he do when they turned into small but powerful predators? And how long could he hide them from prying eyes? The sound of an approaching car made his heart freeze. He recognized the government-issued Patriot of the hunting inspector. Standing at the doorstep of his house was a young inspector in a spotless uniform, Yuri Volkov. He had come to ask questions. Antip greeted the inspector with his usual sternness. Yes, he had heard shots. No, he hadn't seen anyone suspicious. The forest was large, and there were many people walking around. Yuri nodded, but his keen gaze scanned the yard, the shed, and the old man himself. He smelled of anxiety. "May I look around the property, Zakharovich? Standard procedure?" Volkov said politely, but insistently. Antip's heart sank. "Look around if you have nothing better to do," he muttered, trying to appear indifferent. They approached the barn. Marfa, hearing the unfamiliar footsteps, grunted anxiously. Antip froze, but no other sound came from the barn. The inspector peered into the semi-darkness. He saw a huge pig lying in the far corner. Nothing unusual. But something in the air, some faint smell, seemed strange to Yuri. Not just the smell of a pigsty. Something else. Wild. Forest. He was about to leave when his gaze fell on the ground at the entrance. A tiny footprint was imprinted in the damp clay, not a pig's, not a human's. 5 little toes and a pad. Yuri slowly looked up at Antip. The old man stood with his gnarled hands clenched into fists, his face a stone mask. At that moment, the inspector didn't know what he was looking for, but he knew for sure that the old man was lying to him. And in the forest, dozens of kilometers away, a large brown bear rose to her feet. Her wound had healed. Hunger and maternal instinct drove her forward. She followed an invisible trail left by her memory. She was going after her children. Silence hung between them, heavy as the damp forest air. Yuri Volkov did not take his eyes off Antip's face, trying to read something other than stubbornness there. Antip paused, then slowly bent down, as if his old back was struggling to bend, and smeared the footprint with the toe of his boot. "A weasel, I tell you, Inspector. Or a marten, a forest visitor. They're always hanging around here stealing chickens." His voice was flat and hollow, like the sound of wood hitting wood. Yuri smiled, but his eyes did not smile. "A weasel's tracks are different, Zakharovich. I may have learned from books, but I can tell the difference." He took a step back from the barn, as if giving the old man space. "Here's what I'll say. We're looking for a female bear, a wounded one. If she was without cubs, that's one thing. But if she had cubs, then they're out there somewhere alone. They won't last long." He looked intently at Antip. "And hiding wild animals, especially predators, that's a serious offense. Very serious. As a former gamekeeper, you should know that." He wasn't threatening. He was stating a fact, and it was scarier than any threat. "All the best, Zakharovich. I'll be back." The UAZ turned around and, kicking up dust, disappeared around the bend. Antip stood for a long time, watching him go. The stone mask slipped from his face, revealing fatigue and anxiety. The young wolf had picked up the scent, and he would not let it go. Meanwhile, 30 kilometers from the farm, a real wolf, or rather a bear, was struggling to wade across a fast-flowing rocky river. The water was icy, knocking her off her feet and making the wound on her side ache. But the bear stubbornly pressed on. Each step was dictated not by reason, but by a force as ancient as the forest itself. Instinct led her along an invisible thread of scent, guided by her memory of the landscape. She remembered this river, remembered the rock on the other bank, knew that beyond it lay a familiar pine forest. She did not know if her children were alive. She didn't know how much time had passed. She knew only one thing: she had to keep going. At night, she found anthills and licked the fat larvae or dug up juicy roots. Her strength returned slowly, but with every kilometer she traveled, her confidence grew. The scent, it was getting stronger. A faint but familiar smell of her den, her territory, her cubs. She was going home. She didn't know that her home was empty. Life on the farm was flowing in a new, dangerous direction. The cubs, whom Antip had mentally named Mishka and Mashka, turned into active, curious creatures. Their brown fur became shiny, their paws grew stronger. They no longer just ate, but also played. Their favorite game was to climb onto Marfa's patient back while she dozed in the sun. They rolled around in the straw, clumsily wrestling with each other and making funny growling noises. Antip, watching them from a crack in the barn boards, felt his hard heart melt. He had not felt such quiet joy in many, many years. But the joy was poisoned by fear. It was becoming increasingly difficult to hide them. The smell from them was now thick and forest-like. And their voices, though still childish, no longer sounded like squeaks. It was growling. Toy growling, perhaps. Every day, Antip waited for the inspector to return. He fell asleep and woke up with one thought. What would he do when his secret was revealed? Give them away? Where? To the zoo? To a shelter? After the warmth of their mother's affection, even if it was a pig's, it would be a death sentence for them. Yuri Volkov returned to the forest. He didn't believe the old man, but he had nothing to prove. He needed evidence. He decided to approach it from a different angle. If the bear had cubs, then there had to be a den somewhere. He began methodically, square by square, combing the area of the forest where he had found the shell casing. He was stubborn and attentive. On the second day of his search, he stumbled upon it. Under the roots of an uprooted pine tree, in a dry hollow, he found what he was looking for. A den. The place where the bear had given birth. The earth still held her scent. And in the moss bedding, he found several short, stiff brown hairs. Cubs. There was no doubt left. The bear had been with her cubs, and now the cubs were gone. And the only person for miles around was an old gamekeeper who was hiding something. The puzzle in the inspector's head was coming together. He didn't see the whole picture yet, but its outlines were becoming clearer. He got into his car. Now he knew what to do. He would go back to Antip. But this time, he would be ready. He would set up a hidden camera trap on the path leading to the farm. Sooner or later, the old man would make a mistake. That same night, Antip woke up to a strange sound. It wasn't Marfa grunting or the cubs fussing. The sound came from outside, a hollow, mournful howl that made his blood run cold. Only a wolf howls like that. But it wasn't a wolf. Antip went to the window. The moon bathed the yard in silvery light. No one was there. But he knew what it meant. Predators had caught the scent of easy prey, the smell of bear cubs, unprotected by their mother's fury. He took his old but trusty rifle. He didn't sleep until dawn, sitting on the porch and listening to the nighttime rustles. The forest that had been his home all his life now seemed hostile. He looked at it, and it seemed to him that the forest was looking back at him with thousands of hungry, invisible eyes. He was protecting his strange, impossible family. But he didn't know that the main threat was not coming from the darkness of the thicket. It was following his own trail. The she-bear stood on top of the hill. The wind carried scents to her. The smell of smoke from the chimney. The smell of livestock. And among them, the one that made her heart beat faster. The subtle, sweet smell of her milk mixed with the smell of her children. It came from there, from the small island of light in the darkness of the night. From the farm. She didn't understand how they had ended up there. She didn't know what awaited them there. Rage and maternal instinct mixed together in her into a fiery cocktail. She saw her goal. Slowly, without taking her eyes off the lights of the farm, she began to descend the hill. Each step she took was silent. Every muscle in her huge body tensed, ready to pounce. The mother was going to take back what was hers, and woe to anyone who stood in her way. Antip was not the first to sense her presence. Marfa felt it first. The sow, dozing in the barn, suddenly raised her head. Her ears twitched nervously, picking up a low-frequency hum that was not yet audible to human ears. She stood up, sniffing the air anxiously. The piglets, awakened by her sudden movement, huddled together behind her massive back. Martha let out a short, hollow grunt. It was not the sound of maternal concern. It was a warning signal. Antip, sitting on the porch, heard it and immediately knew that something was wrong. He slid silently off the steps, his rifle in his hands. He slowly circled the house, peering into the edge of the forest. And then he saw her. A huge dark silhouette stood motionless by the old fence. A bear. She stood still, only her head slowly turning from side to side, studying, assessing. She did not look aggressive. She looked like a mother who had come to the locked gates of a school to pick up her children. But Antip knew what that outward calm meant. One wrong move, one loud noise, and that silhouette would turn into a killing machine. At that very moment, 2 kilometers from the farm, an alarm went off on Yuri Volkov's laptop screen. The motion sensor on the camera trap he had set up had been triggered. A photo was immediately sent to his email. It was black and white, a little blurry, but there was no doubt. A large brown bear was moving along the trail straight towards Zakarovich's farm. Yuri jumped up. Everything was coming together. The wounded bear had returned, and she was heading for the old man. The inspector didn't know about the cubs. He thought the old man was somehow involved in her injury. Maybe he had finished her off and hidden the carcass. And now she had come back for revenge. Or was it another animal? In any case, a man was in danger. Without wasting a second, he grabbed his rifle and radio and rushed to his car. He had to make it in time. Protocols and instructions flew out of his head. Right now, it was a matter of saving a life. Antip stood motionless. He was between the house and the barn, between the bear and her cubs. Slowly, millimeter by millimeter, he began to raise his rifle. He didn't want to shoot. The thought of killing a mother who had come for her children was sacrilegious to him. But what choice did he have? She would tear the shed apart. She might kill Marfa, who he was sure would rush to defend the cubs. She might even kill him. The bear took a step, then another. She didn't look at Antip. All her attention was focused on the barn, from where the faint smell of her offspring could be detected. She approached the dilapidated wooden wall and pressed her paw against it with force. The dry boards creaked. From inside came Marfa's furious, courageous grunts. The pig was preparing for battle. Antip pressed the butt to his shoulder. His finger rested on the trigger. "Forgive me," he whispered, aiming at the animal's powerful shoulder. At that very moment, the silence was broken by the roar of a car engine, and the headlights hit the yard, blinding both man and beast. Volkov's UAs bounced over the potholes, flew into the farmyard, and slammed on the brakes. Yuri jumped out of the car, holding his carbine at the ready. "Zakarovich, don't shoot! Police!" He shouted the first thing that came to mind, even though he was an inspector, not a police officer. The female bear, blinded and frightened by the roar and light, jumped away from the barn and, letting out a furious roar, reared up. The hair on her mane stood on end, exposing huge yellow fangs. She saw a new threat. 2 people with weapons. Her protective instinct gave way to self-preservation. Antip lowered his rifle, momentarily confused by the sudden appearance of the inspector. That second was enough. The bear turned and took huge leaps away, into the safety of the forest. In an instant, everything was quiet. All that remained was the sound of the UA's engine the smell of gunpowder that wasn't there, and two people breathing heavily from the adrenaline rush. Yuri slowly lowered his carbine. He looked at Antip, then at the shed, at the huge claw marks on the boards. "What's going on here, Zakharovich?" His voice was quiet but firm. Antip was silent. He was devastated. He had almost done something he would never have forgiven himself for. And he had been saved by the man he considered his enemy. From the barn came the reassuring grunts of Marfa and the quiet squeaks of the bear cubs. Now there was no point in hiding anything. "Go. See for yourself," Antip said hoarsely and stepped aside, opening the way to the barn. Yuri, still not fully understanding what was happening, approached the door and cautiously peered inside. In the moonlight, shining through a hole in the wall, he saw a scene that shattered all his preconceptions about the laws of nature. A huge pig lay on the straw, with two small brown bear cubs huddled against its side. They looked peaceful and protected. The inspector stood there for several minutes in complete silence, shifting his gaze from this incredible family to the motionless figure of the old gamekeeper. Yuri left the shed and quietly closed the door behind him. He looked at Antip. There was no longer any suspicion in his eyes, only pure, unclouded amazement. "How?" was the only word he could utter. Antip shrugged. That's how it happened. Their mother disappeared, and Marfa's parents died. So, they got together. He spoke simply, without any attempt to justify himself. He was simply stating a fact, as natural to him as the changing of day and night. Yuri ran his hand over his face. All his instructions, all the protocols, everything he had been taught, turned to dust in the face of this simple, incredible truth. He had to draw up a report, confiscate the animals, fine the old man a huge amount, and possibly even bring criminal charges. It was his duty. But could he? Could he destroy this fragile world that had been created against all odds? "She'll be back," Yuri said quietly, looking in the direction where the bear had disappeared. "She's not gone. She's hiding. She'll wait. And next time, she won't back down." Antip nodded. "I know." They stood silently, each lost in his own thoughts. The young inspector who believed in the law and the old gamekeeper who believed in nature. And both understood that the game had only just begun that night. The main battle was still ahead. The night passed in tense anticipation. Yuri Volkov did not leave. He turned off the engine of his UAZ but remained at the farm, realizing that leaving the old man alone would be signing his death warrant. They sat in Antip's kitchen, small and smelling of dried herbs and stove smoke. Between them stood a mug of cold tea which no one touched. The silence was no longer hostile. It was focused. Two people who, just that morning, had been on opposite sides of the barricades, were now allies in the face of a force that both respected but understood differently. Antip told him everything. About the death of the piglets, about the find in the forest, about how Martha took in the orphans. He spoke without emotion, simply listing the facts. But behind this dry statement, Yuri saw a story of incredible compassion and courage. "Do you realize that she could have killed you and the pig?" Yuri asked, breaking the silence. Antip nodded slowly. "I understand. But she is not an enemy. She is a mother, and I understand her." This simple phrase struck Yuri to the core. He was used to seeing bears as objects to be protected or sources of danger. The old man saw in her an equal being, driven by the same feelings. At dawn, they went out into the yard. The forest was quiet and peaceful, as if the night's drama had never happened. But they both knew she was there, watching, waiting. "What shall we do?" Yuri asked, Now it was not a question from an inspector to a trespasser. It was a question from one man to another. "Wait," Antip replied simply. "She must understand that there is no threat here. She must see that they are alive and well." The old man's plan was insanely risky, but Yuri suddenly realized that there was no other way out. Trying to take the cubs by force would provoke an attack. Killing the bear was unthinkable. All that remained was to trust the wisdom of the old man and the instincts of the animals. Yuri contacted the base on his radio. He reported that he had found a wounded bear, that she was not aggressive if not provoked, and that he was staying put to keep watch. He deliberately left out the cubs and Antip. It was a lie to save lives, the first serious lie of his entire career, and it came surprisingly easily to him. The next 2 days turned into a strange standoff. The bear did not leave. During the day, she lay in thick raspberry bushes on the hillside, from where she had a perfect view of the entire farm. Antip and Yuri saw the branches swaying and knew she was there. At night, she came closer. Sometimes they could hear her heavy breathing just a few dozen meters from the house. She didn't try to attack. She was studying. She listened to the sounds coming from the barn, the squeaks of her children mixed with the calm grunts of the pig. She could smell them, and there was no fear in her scent. Antip continued to live his normal life as if nothing was happening. He brought Marfa food and cleaned the pen. He did this deliberately, in full view of the invisible observer. He showed her that her children were not being harmed. Yuri became his shadow, always nearby, with his rifle slung over his shoulder, ready for any surprise. He saw how the bear cubs, already accustomed to Antip's voice, nudged his boots while he poured food for their foster mother. The scene was so surreal that he had to constantly remind himself that it was not a dream. On the third night, something changed. The female bear approached the fence. She didn't growl. She made a quiet, guttural sound, something like a question. Someone answered her from the barn. Hearing their mother's call, the cubs squealed and rushed to the wall, trying to squeeze through the cracks. Marfa grunted anxiously, but did not interfere. She stood behind them, as if giving them freedom of choice, but ready to intervene at any moment. "It's time," Antip said quietly, standing with Yuri at the window. "She's ready to negotiate." The old man took the bucket with the remains of the porridge that Marfa loved so much and went out onto the porch. "Are you crazy?" Yuri hissed at his back. But Antip did not listen. He slowly walked toward the barn. The female bear by the fence tensed but did not move. She watched as the old man opened the barn door. 2 brown lumps rolled out of the darkness and, squeaking, rushed across the yard toward the fence, toward the smell of their mother. Marfa followed them. She stopped in the middle of the yard, not daring to come closer, but not leaving either. She just stood there and watched her foster children reunite with their real mother. The she-bear, seeing her cubs alive and unharmed, forgot everything else in the world. She poked them with her snout, sniffed them, and licked them. They climbed on her, bit her ears, happy and excited. It was a touching, idyllic scene. Antip and Yuri watched, holding their breath. Then the female bear raised her head. Her gaze met that of the pig standing 10 meters away. 2 maternal gazes. There was no hostility in them, only silent understanding. The she-bear made the same quiet, guttural sound. Marfa grunted briefly in response. It was their dialogue, understandable without words. "Thank you," said the she-bear. "Take care of yourself," replied the pig. Then the she-bear looked at Antip, a long, attentive look. Antip nodded slightly to her, as if to an old acquaintance. At that moment, he felt no fear, only respect. It seemed that the worst was over. The she-bear had found her children and made sure they were all right. Now she had to take them back to the forest. But she was in no hurry. She let the cubs play around the fence for a while longer, then gently but firmly led them back into the darkness. But not into the forest. Instead, she took them to the thickets by the stream, just 100 meters from the farm. "Why isn't she leaving?" asked Yuri. "They're still too weak for a long journey," replied Antip, who seemed to be reading the animal's mind. "She found them. Now she needs a safe place for them to grow stronger, and she decided that this is safe." This realization stunned Yuri. The bear had not simply forgiven the humans. She trusted them. She had decided to stay with those whom, just a few days ago, she had considered a mortal threat. This fragile world, born on the brink of life and death, had not fallen apart. It had only grown stronger. But just at that moment, when the tension seemed to have eased, a new sound came from the forest. Angry, barking dogs and people shouting. Poachers. They had returned to finish off the wounded animal, and they were heading straight for the sound coming from the bear family. The barking grew closer, furious and impatient. Antip and Yuri exchanged glances. Their faces wore the same expression, grim determination. All their fragile truce with nature could collapse in a second at the hands of those who had come to the forest only to take. "Take Marfa to the barn. Quick!" Yuri commanded, raising his rifle. He was no longer an inspector following protocol. He was a man defending his territory. Antip, without saying a word, rushed to the sow, who was already shifting nervously from foot to foot, sensing a new threat. A furious roar rang out from the stream. The bear realized that the trap had snapped shut. On one side was the farm and the people she had just begun to trust. On the other, the dogs and those who smelled of blood and death. She drove the cubs into the thick undergrowth and stood up to defend them, turning into a growling mountain of muscle and fury. 3 figures appeared in the light of the lanterns at the edge of the forest. 2 men with guns and a dog straining at its leash. They clearly did not expect to come across a farmstead. "Hey, owner, have you seen a wounded bear around here?" one of them shouted, cocky and confident. Yuri stepped forward into the circle of light from the porch. His inspector's uniform and the carbine in his hands had the effect of a bomb going off. The poachers froze. "Game warden, drop your weapons. Hands behind your heads." Yuri's voice was icy and did not bode well. The men were confused for only a moment. "Who are you to tell us what to do?" snapped the second one, but his confidence was already cracking. "I'm the one who's going to give you 5 years for illegal hunting in a protected area." Yuri replied calmly, taking a step forward. Weapons on the ground, slowly. At that moment, Antip emerged from behind him. In his hands was an old double-barreled shotgun. He said nothing. He just stood next to the inspector, the old gamekeeper and the young lawman. Together. This sight finally broke the poacher's will. They saw that the joke was over. One of them hesitated, then put his gun on the ground. The second followed suit. The dog, left without its master's support, tucked its tail between its legs and whimpered. "Now turn around and walk to my car. Very carefully," Yuri ordered. While he led the detainees to the UAZ, Antip remained where he was, listening to the silence by the stream. The bear's roar subsided. She realized that the danger had passed. She believed again. In the morning, when Yuri, having waited for backup, took the poachers away, Silence reigned on the farm. Antip went out onto the porch. The bear came out from behind the bushes by the stream. Behind her, like two little brown trailers, her cubs trotted along. She stopped at the edge of the yard. It was goodbye. She looked at Antip, then at the barn where Marfa was quietly grunting. Then she turned and, nudging her cubs, slowly walked toward the forest, toward the reserve. She did not look back. Antip watched them for a long time until they disappeared into the morning mist. He felt not joy, but a bright, quiet sadness. His house was empty again, but he was no longer the same man he had been a few weeks ago. This old, unsociable hermit, by interfering in the affairs of nature, had found something he had long lost: meaning. He went into the barn. Martha was lying on the straw, alone. She raised her intelligent eyes to him. There was no longing in them, only calm and dignity. Her mission was accomplished. She had done everything she could. She had saved strangers' children because her mother's heart knew no difference between species. Antip scratched her behind the ear. "Thank you, Martha," he said quietly. And the pig, as if understanding everything, grunted gratefully in response. Several months passed. Late autumn arrived. The forest was painted in shades of gold and crimson. Yuri Volkov sometimes stopped by Antip's house, not on duty, just because. He brought bread, sugar, and fresh newspapers. They sat on the porch and were silent for a long time, looking at the forest. In his report, Yuri wrote dry official lines. During the raid, traces of a wounded bear were found. The pursuit of the poachers who presumably wounded the animal led to their arrest. The threat to the local population has been eliminated. Not a word about the bear cubs, not a word about the pig. He kept the old gamekeeper's secret because he understood that there are laws higher than those written on paper. One of those days, as they sat on the porch, Antip suddenly froze and squinted, looking at the far bank of the stream. Yuri followed his gaze. There, at the water's edge, stood 3 bears, one large female bear and 2 cubs that had already grown considerably. They drank water, played, and wrestled. They were strong and healthy. The female bear raised her head for a moment and looked toward the farm. Antip wasn't sure, but it seemed to him that she nodded. And then the whole family disappeared into the thicket. The miracle that happened that summer on a small farmstead lost in the forest did not end there. It simply returned home, back to where it belonged, to the very heart of wild, wise, and infinitely just nature. What do you think? Was Inspector Yuri right to hide the truth in his report?